Tonight we head to Ferguson, Missouri, where the police chief there has finally given protesters around the country what they've been asking for: the name of the officer who shot and killed 18-year-old Michael Brown. This is the chief backpedals away from comments he made about why Brown was stopped by the officer in the first place. Also, Andrew Cuomo's Democratic challenger Zephyr Teachout has cleared up some questions about her New York residency and proven that she's qualified to run for the governor's job. At least that's what a judge is saying. Now Teachout's getting a big boost from her campaign while Cuomo heads back to court. Is she an actual threat to Cuomo, or just in this race, small change? Plus, speaking of change, we'll look at a spin-off of a Michael Bloomberg push to reward families in need, one that's also playing out in Memphis. Giving kids cash for going to school and doing well. Does the program make the grade? Good evening and welcome to RFL. I'm Andrew Whitman, in tonight for Richard French, and we begin tonight again in Ferguson, Missouri, where police have released the name of the police officer who pulled the trigger and killed 18-year-old Michael Brown. The Ferguson police chief says Officer Darren Wilson, a 6-year veteran of the force, fired the shots that killed the unarmed teenager. And tonight there are conflicting reports over how that altercation unfolded. Police Chief Thomas Jackson initially reported that Brown was approached after the officer heard over the radio that there was a convenience store robbery in the area. Today, surveillance video of that robbery was released, and police say Brown and his friend Dorian Johnson were suspects. Police say they stole a $48 box of cigars. MSNBC, among other sources, reporting that Johnson told them that he and Brown were in fact responsible for the robbery. But earlier today, the chief changed his statement, saying that the officer didn't know that Brown was a suspect in the robbery when he approached him, and that he stopped Brown for walking in the middle of the street and blocking traffic. That's when police say Brown reached into the officer's car and attempted to grab his gun. Witnesses say the officer fired shots from his car and then got out of the car, firing more shots at Brown. They also say that Brown's arms were up when the officer fired the fatal shots. Brown's parents say the police are trying to assassinate their son's character by releasing that video. The recent developments have stunned protesters. Last night, though, marked the first evening of peaceful protests this week after local police were pulled off security and state highway patrol officers stepped in. No riot gear, no armored vehicles, no rifles trained on the crowd, as we had seen just the night before. The protests not just limited to Ferguson, they unfolded from Texas to this protest all the way in Times Square. And for more, we're going to bring in our panel tonight. We begin with Shelley Mayer. She is a Democratic New York State Assemblywoman, represents the city of Yonkers in Albany. Back with us is Noam Bramson. He is the Democratic Mayor of New Rochelle and was the 2013 Democratic nominee for Westchester County Executive. And we are joined, as always, by Dominic Carter, political journalist and author. Let's start first with the situation on the ground overnight in Ferguson last night, the peaceful aspect that we saw, and what that says about how you approach particularly incendiary situations like the one we've seen in Ferguson over the last couple of weeks. Sometimes you don't need a big police response.
Well, I think that's exactly right. And what it illustrates is that there was a desire on the part of both the police and the protesters to find some accommodation, which let all of them proceed with their responsibilities and an expression of their views. And I think to have new leadership in place, which recognize that a partnership between the community and the police force is almost always the best way to secure public safety and public order, was absolutely vital in moving things forward.
But I just think we need to acknowledge that until the governor stepped in and changed the leadership of what was happening on the ground there, we had a situation where, honestly, the visual image of what the police department was doing when confronted with generally peaceful protests was unacceptable in this day and age in a diverse America. And I really think, you know, credit to the governor, although it seemed like he was too late, in my opinion.
Took a while.
But until that happened, we had a militarized police department facing a rather peaceful protest and outcry that people are entitled to exercise their constitutional right to protest, and the police have an obligation to do an independent investigation. But the situation was handled poorly and frankly unacceptably.
And to be fair, there was looting, there were some
Yes.
bottles thrown and Molotov cocktails thrown at the police. But Dom, it makes you wonder why they chose to respond, the Ferguson police, the way they did in such a paramilitary fashion that seemed to make the situation so much worse.
Well, historically, I believe, Andrew, that law enforcement has a perspective of if we have to crack down, and for lack of a better word, crack heads, then we will, meaning that if that's necessary. what the governor did in this situation was the right thing to do. They went and got the highest ranking African American from the state police and put him in charge. And having grown up in that area, see, because what's happening is the community has been victimized twice. It was victimized with this shooting, in which we don't know all the facts yet, even though they appear almost very clear. And the second time was when they appeared law enforcement, as I think we agree, it may have went a bit step far. The second time they were victimized was with law enforcement. And so when you have someone that can walk in and be of that community and say, no, we don't need riot helmets, we don't need police dogs, you have to understand the historical perspective of, for African Americans, the moment that you bring out a police dog. That you cannot win. And that's why the NYPD does not do it. As I said last night, they will have 2,000 cops in riot gear a mile from the location, and that can be called in at immediate notice. But you don't want to throw gasoline on that to further that Molotov cocktail, and that's exactly what they were doing.
Go ahead.
I just want to add, I think there's a real issue of leadership. I do not blame the police officers of Ferguson who are following orders of their police chief. But I do blame a police chief who made a determination to respond in a way that exacerbated the situation, put his own officers at risk as well as members of the community. And this is why the appointment of quality commissioners and people who are in charge, as the mayor knows, is so essential. They make these decisions. It's not the officer, it's the commanding officer.
And there was another decision made by the Ferguson police today that was somewhat questionable, that the release of that video from the convenience store robbery, at the same time the police came out and said that wasn't the reason that the officer approached Michael Brown in the first place, which then begs the question of what value was the release of that video. Now, I know it comes on the same day that the officer's name was released, so there might be a little bit of information coming out on both sides, but is there any rationale for releasing that video other than painting Michael Brown or trying to justify the...
Yes, it's called a smear campaign. That's what it's called. I don't understand. Listen, we have to know, and the video does not make Mr. Brown look good if that is indeed him. He's towering over this man, apparently...
Pushes him right into the rack there.
And it's awful. And I have to say, it makes you wonder... I'm going to be honest, as an African American, who is teaching our kids that they can behave in this fashion? And so that part bothers me. But at the same time, and Mr. Mayor, I'm going to give you your fair say here, but at the same time, what's the point in releasing it today? Is it because you're pouting? Because you had to release the name of the officer that's involved in this shooting? It makes the chief look bad again. And let's be honest about this. His career in law enforcement is over. As soon as this case is over, he will be forced to retire. So it just doesn't look good. You got to release it, but why not wait until tomorrow? Because now there's speculation that there may be violence tonight.
Yes.
Look, whenever you get into the weeds with respect to the details of these incidents and a tick-tock of what happened when, it's almost always more complex and messy and morally ambiguous than it might seem when you're looking at a one-dimensional account. But I think there's a deeper truth that underlines what's happening here and what's happened in other recent incidents as well. And it's that we all have to understand that this country is a long way away from cleansing itself of its original sins with regard to race. If you look at...
No question.
Wait.
Yeah.
I didn't say it.
No, I'm not.
I just want to be clear.
If you look,
Mr. Mayor.
And you know this, Dominic.
Mr. Mayor, I love you. Mr. Mayor, I love you.
You too,
I love you,
Dominic.
Mr. Mayor.
But you know,
I love you.
It's not just...
I didn't say it.
It's not just what we perceive, though, right?
Okay.
It's not just what we perceive. If you look at the statistics related to four-year graduation rates, related to extracurricular enrichment, related to family structure, related to discipline within the school system, related to incarceration rates, they expose brutal realities that are challenged to values that almost all of us claim to believe in deeply. And I don't know what the answer is. It's probably not any single answer, but pretending that the problem doesn't exist is a sure road to failure. And that is the underlying dynamic that makes events like this so enormously explosive and which makes it relevant to the entire country.
I want to get to one other related issue to all of this, and this is something that we touched on last night too, the militarization of our local police departments. Even I mean, you had as disparate characters as Rand Paul and Elizabeth Warren coming out and criticizing it yesterday. But the scenes that we've seen from Ferguson with the tear gas and the paramilitary uniforms, and they're in armored personnel vehicles, this is all part of a Defense Department program and under federal law that allows local governments to receive these things from the military once the military is done using them. The Times has a great interactive map that shows what municipalities, what counties have gotten what stuff since 2006. The Essex County, New Jersey has gotten, a whole slew of military personnel. I don't think anybody begrudges them the right, police departments, to use this when it's necessary. Is the challenge figuring out when to deploy these resources, or should we just be worried that they have these resources at all? I'm quite harping on my leadership theme because I think it's so essential. And it draws on what the mayor said. The leader must acknowledge the sensitivity of the community they police. This chief was policing a community that is predominantly African American with a predominantly white police force. If you can't figure out what is a boiling point by putting in these heavily armed officers and all of this paramilitary, you shouldn't be the police chief. But they have the material. I don't begrudge them. If for some reason they need it, fine, but they didn't need it then. I've heard a lot of people say first responsibility is making sure that the safety of the officers who are responding to a scene, and in this case, protecting property and making sure that the crowd doesn't get out of control as justification for the use of the material. I don't think anyone can justify what they did.
Part of our problem is we oscillate from one extreme to another. So when you have a situation in which military equipment is being provided to rural police departments in South Dakota in order to respond to an imagined terrorist threat, we know we've gone too far. And I don't doubt there are many police departments which are looking at these things as the latest shiny toy and are deploying them in ways that are totally inappropriate. But let's not go to the other extreme, and let's remember that the federal government does have a useful role in providing appropriate police departments with the tools to respond to crisis situations and protect the safety of officers, protect the safety of the public. So there's a happy medium, a reasonable medium to be achieved.
And unfortunately, we see examples where that happy medium doesn't seem to be being achieved. We tend to go too far with it. All right, we're going to switch gears, and up next, an interesting debate, cashing in on class. Some students are making the grade and making an extra buck in the process, and tonight we're going to speak with a champion of a program that essentially pays kids to go to school and do well in school. We're also going to hear from somebody who doesn't think that's as wise an idea. That and more after the break.